Hi, I'm Will. I like to perform electronic music under the name Lectronin. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to describe some experiences I've had in trying to set up a live electronic music rig, some of the issues I've encountered, and why I think the SH4D and Circuit Tracks might be a good solution both for myself and others in a similar situation. We'll cover how to connect the devices, assign parts to their various tracks, and then I'll take you step by step through how I created a live performance that I've already posted to YouTube. If you find this video useful, or even if you don't, please feel free to comment and let me know why. I truly appreciate the feedback. Over the years, I've played out live with DAWs, primarily Ableton, and I've played out live with DAW-less setups. While the DAW-centered configurations have been fairly simple to set up live, the audience has no conception of what's happening inside the box. The DAW-less configuration sometimes had so much gear with so many connections, it would take an hour or more to set up. What I recently decided to do was to find a way to simplify the setup into a few select, compact, battery-operated units that would give me a faithful reproduction of any particular song, while allowing freedom to sculpt the sound and elements of the sequences live. This particular pair makes a great starting point for such a setup. What I have here is the Roland SH-4d desktop synthesizer and the Novation Circuit Tracks Groovebox. While I'm not going to go into full details about each unit's various features, I will talk about some of the various features that help one unit to complement the other. As a desktop synthesizer, the SH4D gives me a lot of hands-on control of its 4 polyphonic synth parts, often with one knob to function control of many of the parameters right here in this synthesizer control panel. The Circuit Tracks gives me 2 MIDI sequencer channels, right here and here, that I can use to sequence 2 of the SH4D synth parts in a more flexible and robust way than the SH4D's built-in sequencer allows me to do. Since the Circuit Tracks is a groove box, it also gives me 2 of its own polyphonic synths, each with its own sequencer channel. The SH4D allows each of the synthesizer parts to be sent to a reverb, a chorus, and a delay, in addition to each part's own effects. It also allows me to strap a master effects over the stereo output. The Circuit Tracks allows me to bring in the affected stereo outputs from the SH4D into its own mix via the external inputs on the back. It also serves as the master MIDI clock and controls the playback of both units. It offers its own delay and reverb send effects, so there's this delay and its reverb. It also offers 4 drum tracks dedicated to playing back samples. All of the internal and external signals can be sidechain compressed to one of the drum channels. Since I was developing, practicing, and recording, I decided to plug both units into a power source using USB-C on the back of the units, even though they can be battery operated and independent. I want the Circuit Tracks to be the master controller and have it trigger the SH4D. I plug a MIDI cable into the MIDI out on the back of the Circuit Tracks and plug the other end into the MIDI in of the SH4D. Now you have to make sure that the MIDI clock transmit is enabled on the setup page of the Circuit Tracks. So to do that, you hit Shift and go over to the Save button. Above that it says Setup. That'll bring us to the Setup menu. And now you can see the MIDI assignments up here. MIDI 1 is set to MIDI output 3. MIDI 2 is set to MIDI output 4. And I'll explain how that works over here on the SH4D. I go to Menu by holding Shift and Menu, whoops, not this hold, Shift and Menu right there. And then I enter into the system settings, and then I scroll down until I get to the MIDI part of things. And here, if I go up, you can see the tempo is sync mode is set to auto. So that means that if it receives a clock mode, it will slave to the master device. And likewise, this has its transmit on as well. So that means it's going to be transmitting over to the SH4D. Also, I can see where the channels are set to receive. So part 1 is set to channel 1, part 2 is set to channel 2, part 3 is set to channel 3, part 4 is set to channel 4. So I've set MIDI 1 to channel 3, so that's going to come over and control this channel here, part 3 I should say, and MIDI 2 to channel 4, sorry, part 4. Now, synth 1 and synth 2 I've set to MIDI channel 5 and MIDI channel 6 since they have no assignment here on the SH4D. And that is to be sure that as I play synths 1 and 2, they can be independent and their MIDI is not going to trigger anything over here. And that leaves me parts 1 and 2 to be sequenced by the SH4D itself. So with 2 synths on the on the circuit tracks and 4 synth parts on the SH4D, I have 6 synth tracks to play with in total. Since I can create up to 8 different 32-step sequences, and I'll show you how to do that here. Have to play to get out of this menu. If we go to patterns here, each one of these is a sequence, like a step sequence. So synth 1 has 1, 2, 3, 4, and if we go down to the second page, 5, 6, 7, 8 different sequences that can be up to 32 steps. And the same is true of all these tracks right here. So I can have 8 different 32-step sequences per tracks on this unit. And I can chain all of the consecutive tracks, all the consecutive sequences per track. So if I go back to the patterns, I can say chain these 2 sequences together, or these 2 sequences together, or 3 of them together. And then we'll just play one after another and then repeat and loop back. So therefore, I have more creative sequencing and development options on these circuit tracks compared to the single 64-step sequence per part on the SH4D. So MIDI 2, which is closest to drum 1 on the circuit tracks, is assigned to part 4 on the SH4D, which I use to create my bass line. MIDI 1, which is assigned to part 3 on the SH4D, is used to control a synth pad. Synths 1 and 2 on the circuit tracks are used for lead synths. With the remaining unused parts on the SH4D, I assign part 2, which is represented here by the mute switch when we go into the proper mode, which is hit pattern and sound. That brings us into mix mode. So part 2 here, that's the mute switch. This is assigned to a melodic sequence, and part 1 is assigned to a sequence arpeggio that is played back randomly. And what I'll do is I'll mute and unmute each of these parts as I need them. Back on the circuit tracks, I've assigned drum 1 to a kick drum, drum 2 to a snare, drum 3 to hats, and drum 4 to toms and a reverse cymbal for section fills. The tom, snare, and reverse cymbals are samples I purchased on Splice. Even though I won't be using the drums on the SH4D at all, the kick and hats on the circuit tracks were actually sampled from the SH4D synth drum kit. And then with a separate unit, I was uploading it to the circuit tracks using Novation's component software. For my live performing purposes, both devices work best in their mix modes. The mix page on the circuit tracks, which is accessed via the mixer button, the mix page on the circuit tracks allows me to mute and unmute the various tracks. You can see their mutes here, like that. It also allows me to trigger scenes, which are represented down here, which represent a section of my song. Each scene triggers a sequence pattern or chain of sequence patterns per track. So each scene can kind of trigger its own selection of sequences. If we go back here to mixer and I choose a different scene, like say I choose this one here, we'll go back to the patterns and we'll see a different set of patterns are selected. They also recall a predetermined configuration of mute and unmuted channels. So as I go through the scenes and I select different scenes, you can see the various mutes turn on and off here. The mix configuration on the SH4D, which we're in now, but I'll show you how to get in there. Say like we're in this kind of pattern mode when it starts up or something like that. All you have to do is press pattern and then press sound. And that brings it into its mix mode. The blue lit pattern buttons allow me to mute and unmute the MIDI sequences. So sequences 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is the rhythm part, which I'm not using, these are enabled. 3 and 4 are not really going to affect anything because these are, again, muting and unmuting MIDI. There is no MIDI information on the SH4D itself for these tracks. These tracks are controlled over here on the circuit tracks. These 4 faders allow me to fade in and out the various parts. The buttons below each fader allow me to select that fader's part, or the part assigned to that fader, allow me to use these knobs to control the part's synthesis parameters and the effects sends. Now that I have my live performance strategy in place, it's time to record various sequences for the tracks and assemble them together in a way that allows the song to grow and develop. Since the scenes on the circuit tracks represent the various sections of my song, I'll discuss this process scene by scene. You can then watch my performance on the video and see me enable these live on the original video that I posted for this song. So, scene 1. To open the song, I select scene 1 and I hit play. My song opens with the bass sequence on MIDI 2, unmuted on the circuit tracks, and the melodic sequence on part 2, unmuted on the SH4D. Both sounds are playing back on the SH4D, and I start to open the filter on the melodic synth. On drum 4, I have a loop sequence that triggers the reverse cymbal. The sample is so long that it takes over 1 measure to reach its apex. So I have to be careful in how I time this in hitting this sample here. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I triggered scene 2 to fire off at the end of the sample. Scene 2 unmutes the kick on drum 1, which is selected as the sidechain input for the other instruments. I can then go back and open part 2 a little bit more. And when I'm ready to move on to scene 3, I'll unmute drum 4 for the reverse cymbal again. So scene 3 unmutes the synth pad on MIDI 1, and I close the filter down again on part 2. Now, when I'm ready to go on to scene 4, I'm going to unmute drum 4, which has another fill, but this time it's got a tom fill associated with it. And I'm also going to have to mute part 2 and unmute part 1. So here we go. 2, 3, 4. So in the downbeat of scene 4, I take out the melodic synth on part 2 and unmute the random arpeggio on part 1. The snare and hats on drum 2 and 3 are now unmuted by the scene and added to the mix. The hat sequence is kind of a straight sequence with a little occasional open hat here on the end. And when I'm ready, I fill into section 5. I'll mute the random arpeggio as we go into it. But since 1 and 2 have been unmuted, eventually I bring that random arpeggio back in, select it, and start bringing its cutoff up, opening the filter. And then we'll do another tom fill into scene 6. Now in scene 6, all the drum tracks are muted by the scene, leaving the pad, the bass, and of course the random arpeggio playing over here. This bass is now playing a more rhythmically open line. So I can continue opening up the random arpeggio here in the filter for a few bars, and then eventually turn my attention to the bass. So I come over here to track 4 to select the bass so I can now work with its synthesis. And we begin by changing the sustain on the bass and opening up from 0. Now we start to get more of a sustain on the bass. Also, we come over here and open the filter. And you'll hear more of that sustain as the higher tones come in. And then I'm going to bring in some, some of the delay here. Delay send. And then I'm going to unmute drums 2 through 4, which are going to trigger an aggressive fill of tom, snare, and reverse cymbal, and then I'll trigger scene 9. 1, 2, 3. So now the bass is hammering a pedal point in its lower notes while playing a kind of accented melody in its upper notes. Drum 3 is unmuted and playing an aggressive random hat sequence that accentuates the noise of the open hats. Then I'll unmute the synth melody on part 2 and begin to open his filter to match the bass. Now drum 4 contains a more broad tom fill with microstep flams. I'll show you that part right here. So you can see the notes here, but if I go into the microstep button and choose some of these, there we go. And then I'll just unmute drum 4 and trigger sing 12. 1, 2, 3, 4. So scene 12 is going to mute scenes synths 1 and 2, MIDI 1, and drums 1 through 3. Drum 1 through 3 are playing the kick and snare and hats as usual. The bass and pad are now playing a new harmonic progression, while synths 1 and 2 perform a call and response with each other. While the bass is back to playing an 8th note bass line, it now retains the increased sustain, open filter, and delay it acquired in scene 6. I eventually add back in the random arpeggio on part 1. I'll open up its filter a bit too. It's already open. And then I'm going to do another tom fill on drum 4 into scene 13. So I unmute the melodic synth on part 2, bring that in, because scene 13 is otherwise almost identical to scene 12. Now drum 4 has the broader tom fill, which I'll use to carry us into scene 14, which is the final scene. So scene 14 mutes the snare and hats, and also synths 1 and 2. The only synths now playing are the 4 parts in the SH4D, and then of course the kick drum channel. So I come over here and start to bring down the filter on the melodic sequence. And also do the same to the random arpeggio. Next, I start to fade out the melodic part and eventually bring down the pad as well. Now I allow the random arpeggio and bass on parts 1 and 4 to continue for a while, and as I feel we're near the end of the track, press the play button, and that stops all sequence playback on both units, while the final notes of the arpeggio and bass repeat and fade through the delay and reverb tail. So that's basically how I put this track together. Now, there's more options here I could do for, modifying things other than the filter, or, other parts I could try to bring in. Some of it's complex, and I'm still new to these units and getting used to the setup. But I hope this is helpful for someone out there who's looking at either the SH4D or the Circuit Tracks. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments section. I'd love to reply. Also, if you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you want to see future videos, please subscribe. Thank you for watching.